All right, church, good morning. We were in 1 Corinthians 14, and 1 Corinthians 14 is a very practical chapter. And the main thing that Paul, I think, is getting across in this chapter that we need to take home and apply in our church context is the importance of building one another up. And that's really what spiritual gifts are about. In fact, here in chapter 14, Paul goes to great lengths to show us that prophecy is better than speaking in tongues. It is a superior gift, okay? Prophecy is a more important, a better spiritual gift than tongues. Now, why? Well, because prophecy builds up one another. Whereas tongues or other gifts, if it's not intelligible or helpful to those who are listening or watching, then it tends to not help others, but to elevate the self. So we should always think about spiritual gifts in the light of chapter 13. Okay, there's a reason why the love chapter comes between chapter 12 and chapter 14, both on spiritual gifts. We should take the spiritual gifts and we should put them through the love grid of 1 Corinthians 13. And so we should ask, these spiritual gifts, is it envious or boastful? Is it arrogant? Is it rude? Does it insist on its own way? This is all about love here in chapter 13. That's the love grid we should think about spiritual gifts. See, there's a way that we could exercise spiritual gifts to actually elevate the gifted as opposed to serve those in the church. And Paul is emphasizing here, he's stressing the importance of our gifts are meant to build each other up. Prophecy is better than tongues because prophecy instructs, it helps. And there's really an emphasis in this chapter on the importance of instruction, on the importance of teaching, on the importance of when we gather in worship, we engage our minds. The church doesn't get together for worship and we do. No, we actually get together and we speak to each other and we encourage each other. And prophecy is super important in that. Verse 19, I think, is what a verse from the Apostle Paul. Listen to what he says. He says, nevertheless, in the church, when he uses the word church, now we really stretch the meaning of church. So there's a big church, little church. In the New Testament, the word church, like in this instance, Paul is talking about the gathering of the church. This is the assembly. Okay, this is the congregating of Christians together. So this is what he means. He says, in the church, when the church is meeting together for worship, I would rather speak 5 words with my mind in order to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue. It's better to prophesy. And when he talks about prophecy here, he's not talking about like arbitrary predictions about the weather, this is an actual like a teaching, instructive, helpful, edifying word. Okay, that's what he means here by prophecy. And he goes on and explains again why that's important in the context of corporate worship, because if there were an outsider to step into your gathering, if everybody's speaking in tongues, it's going to be completely unintelligible to the outsider, and they're going to walk away confused. However, if an outsider comes and there's prophecy and there's instruction and there's edification, then that will convict the heart of the outsider and he'll fall down and worship God. And then Paul goes in to talk about the importance of order in worship. Again, you got to think if there's spiritual gifts, speaking in tongues, and there's chaos. Paul's like that's not the way that God has designed these gifts. And that's what it's really interesting here in verse 32, where it says the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets, meaning that spiritual gifts don't take control of a person such that the person is just the spiritual gift just kind of takes over and the person has no control or sense of self or authority over the gift. That's a kind of overtaking of the person. That's not the case. Like whatever spiritual gift you have the control, the self-control to exercise the gift or not. Like that's I think that's an important thing here that we can miss by. So the idea of like you being possessed or like taken over by the gift, and where you're exercising the gift and not engaging your mind, that's confusion, that's chaos. That's not how spiritual gifts work. So verse 33, God is not a God of confusion, but of order. And so then Paul gets into this instruction here in 33 to 35 about women being not permitted to speak in the church. And the context here is likely to do with prophecy or tongue. And the issue, most likely, is that there were questions, or there were women speaking in the assembly that was distracting and confusing. And so Paul is telling them, hey, be quiet in the church gathering. Hold that, okay? Ask your husband when you get home. It is interesting, in verse 34, he says, as the law also says. And we have to think, well, where does the law say this? Well, when he says the law, he's most likely referring to Genesis specifically here. A lot of times, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the Torah, also called the law. If we look at 1 Corinthians 11, if we go to 1 Timothy, Paul, when he talks about the relationship between men and women, he refers back to the creation narrative of Genesis 2. And that's most likely what he's thinking about here. And the issue is that in this context, there was a way that the women were speaking in the church that seemed to defy the ordered way of men and women relationships, of husband and wife relationships. And so Paul is saying, hey, as the law says, I think referring back to the creation narrative, keep this in order. There should be a submissiveness between a wife and her husband. And that plays out with a wife in the gathering, not distracting or speaking up or asking questions in a way that's off-putting or even shameful in this context. Again, you have to imagine a church gathering, a smaller church gathering, where someone could interrupt, speak up in a way that was not orderly, but was chaotic and confusing. And so Paul said, hey, don't do that. And then he ends that verse in verse 40. All things should be done decently and in order. So there's a way here to do this that honors who God is, the way that God has designed the world, the universe, how that is reflected in corporate worship. It's not chaotic and ecstatic and wild, but there's an order and there's a purpose, and it is is congruent with the way that God has made the world. 1 Corinthians 14, what a chapter. 1 Corinthians 15, can't wait for that. You guys have a good day.